There exists a figure in Western religious consciousness, so dominant, so psychologically compelling, that his image has shaped everything from medieval artwork to modern cinema. But here's what most people get wrong. Lucifer, the being we've been taught to fear as the embodiment of evil itself, was originally portrayed as something far more nuanced, far more theologically specific, and infinitely more dangerous than simple malevolence. He wasn't just evil. He was the personification of a very particular spiritual sickness: pride, the sin that Christian theology considered so corrosive that it could topple even the most exalted being in creation. This is the story of how one angel's refusal to accept his place in the cosmic hierarchy became the foundation myth for understanding rebellion itself in Western civilization. And it's a story that shifts dramatically depending on who's telling it, when they're telling it, and which theological tradition we're examining. Before we can understand Lucifer as the Lord of Pride, we need to encounter him as he existed in the theological imagination before that catastrophic moment of rebellion. His name itself tells us something crucial. Lucifer, derived from the Latin words for light and to carry, literally means light bringer, or morning star. The Vulgate Bible uses this name in Isaiah 14:12, where the prophet describes the fall of a celestial being described as the morning star, son of the dawn. This wasn't an insult in the original context. It was a title of remarkable honor. Early Christian theologians, building on Jewish mystical traditions, understood Lucifer as the highest of all created beings. He wasn't merely an angel among angels. He was the first of the seraphim, the beings closest to God's throne, whose very substance vibrated with divine light. Some medieval theological texts described him as possessing intelligence so profound that he could barely look upon the reality of God's essence without his being trembling with the weight of that knowledge. He stood at the boundary between creation and divinity, a being so magnificent that even other celestial beings looked upon him with something approaching awe. The irony, the theological tragedy really, is that this magnificence became the soil in which his destruction would grow. Aquinas, the Dominican friar whose theological systematization dominated medieval Christian thought, spent considerable intellectual energy trying to explain how a being so close to perfection could choose corruption. His answer reveals something profound about how medieval theologians understood the mechanics of sin itself. They proposed that Lucifer's very proximity to God, combined with his extraordinary intellect, gave him a clarity about his own nature that proved spiritually catastrophic. He understood himself too well. He comprehended his own power, his own beauty, his own position in creation with such crystalline precision that, somewhere in that perfect understanding, something fractured. This wasn't portrayed as a sudden mutation into evil. Instead, Christian theology, particularly in the Summa Theologiae of Aquinas and the sentences of Peter Lombard, described a gradual reorientation of Lucifer's will. His love, which had been directed toward God and the maintenance of the cosmic order, began to bend backward toward itself. His admiration for the divine plan started to collapse into admiration for himself as an expression of that plan. It was the most subtle corruption imaginable, not a choice of evil, but a choice of self-love over God-love, a choice that created a spiritual gravity well of such intensity that it dragged his entire being downward. To understand Lucifer's specific dominion, we must first grasp why medieval and early modern Christian thinkers placed pride at the apex of the sin hierarchy. In modern thinking, we often treat sins as roughly equivalent moral failures. We might imagine them arranged horizontally: lust here, greed there, pride somewhere in the middle. But Christian theology arranged them vertically in a hierarchy of corruption, and pride occupied the topmost position. The reasoning was philosophically rigorous. Medieval theologians distinguished between two categories of sins: those oriented toward the creature and those oriented away from God. Gluttony, lust, and greed all represent an excessive love of created things. Wrath represents an excessive response to a creature. But pride was categorically different. Pride doesn't love something too much. Pride loves something that shouldn't be loved at all: the self, elevated, above and against the divine order. In the theological system of the time, God created a cosmos with an explicit hierarchy. God stood at the apex. Below God came the various choirs of angels, arranged in descending orders. Then, humanity, created a little lower than the angels, as the Psalms declared. Then, animals, plants, minerals, a great chain of being where every creature had its appointed place and its appointed function. To function correctly, to achieve flourishing, a creature needed to align itself with this order. A stone fulfilled its nature by obeying gravity. A horse fulfilled its nature by serving its created purpose. A human fulfilled their nature by accepting their position as subordinate to God and superior to the animal kingdom. A position of remarkable privilege that carried corresponding responsibility. Pride, then, was the refusal to accept this order. It was the insistence on rearranging the cosmic hierarchy to place oneself higher than one's actual station. And because a creature is most susceptible to this sin, at the apex of its power and intelligence, Lucifer, standing at the very pinnacle of creation, became the being most vulnerable to this particular spiritual poison. The medieval theologian Bonaventure described pride in language worth examining closely. He called it the mother of all sins, not because it logically preceded other sins in some temporal sequence, but because pride was the spiritual orientation that made all other sins possible. Once you've oriented yourself against the cosmic order, once you've decided that your will matters more than God's will, then lying becomes possible, stealing becomes possible, even murder becomes possible. They all flow from that fundamental realignment. But here's where Lucifer's specific role becomes theologically distinct. While other demons might embody greed, lust, or wrath, Lucifer alone carries the burden of representing the pure, undiluted essence of this prideful rejection. He became, in the theological imagination, the being who took the structure of rebellion and made it absolute. He didn't merely want something he shouldn't have. He wanted to remake the entire order of being, to put himself at the center. The fall of Lucifer, as Christian demonology developed it, wasn't depicted as a violent overthrow. Instead, medieval theologians like Aquinas imagined it as a kind of anti-creation, a moment when one being said no to the fundamental reality that had been established. According to their accounts, Lucifer gathered a faction of angels around him. The texts vary on the number, but some propose a third of heaven's angelic host, and organized what we might call a counter-kingdom. He would not serve. He would not accept subordination. He would not permit his will to align with the divine will. And in that refusal, he became something entirely new. Satan. Though that name wasn't his original designation, Satan simply means the adversary. It was a title that emerged from his refusal, not a name he was born with. The theological texts are remarkably specific about the mechanics of how this rejection functioned. In one moment, in the theological instant before time itself had fully structured into linear progression, Lucifer and those demons loyal to him simply could not exist in the presence of God. Not because they were ejected, but because their orientation had become incompatible with that proximity. It's almost as though rejection and expulsion occurred simultaneously. Two aspects of the same spiritual catastrophe. They fell, or perhaps more accurately, they removed themselves to a realm that came to be called hell, a kingdom that existed in sharp opposition to God's kingdom, structured around entirely different principles. And this is crucial. In medieval Christian demonology, hell wasn't presented as simply a punishment imposed from outside. It was portrayed as something Lucifer and his demons created and maintained through their own continued rebellion. They didn't serve a penalty. They perpetuated a choice. Every moment of their existence involved a continuous, renewed refusal to acknowledge the divine order. It was, in a real sense, a never-ending act of pride. The lesser-known theological innovation here is that medieval texts actually debated whether Lucifer and the demons knew, with absolute certainty, that they would lose. Some theologians propose that Lucifer acted in blind rebellion, genuinely believing he could overthrow God. Others suggested something more psychologically subtle, that Lucifer knew resistance was futile, but chose rebellion anyway, preferring, in the famous formulation, to reign in hell than serve in heaven. This distinction matters because it changes whether we're viewing Lucifer as deluded or as consciously choosing damnation for the sake of assertion. Different medieval texts took different positions, and those positions carried different implications about the nature of evil itself. As Christian demonology developed, particularly in the medieval period and into the Renaissance, theology described Lucifer as establishing a kind of shadow kingdom, a grotesque inversion of God's orderly cosmos, where God's realm was characterized by perfect harmony, absolute obedience, and the alignment of all wills with divine will. Lucifer's realm was constructed on principles of disorder, competitive dominance, and the assertion of individual will against all authority. This inverted hierarchy became increasingly specific in medieval texts. The Malleus Maleficarum, that grim early modern manual of demonology, described an elaborate bureaucracy of demonic powers, each with specific domains and specific corrupting functions. But Lucifer stood apart. He wasn't merely the highest-ranking demon, the way a king stands above his nobles. He was the anti-God, the structural opposite of divine authority, present in every act of rebellion, while simultaneously remaining distinct from his subordinates. Medieval texts often depicted Lucifer as so consumed with his own rebellion that he maintained relatively distant from direct human corruption, instead delegating that work to demons with more specific vices. Mammon handled greed, Asmodeus handled lust, Belith handled the various expressions of wrath, but Lucifer presided over the entire structure, maintaining it through an act of will, sustaining the rebellion through sheer pride. He was the emperor of the inverted kingdom, but the fundamental energy that held the kingdom together was his absolute refusal to acknowledge any authority higher than himself. One lesser-known aspect of medieval demonology that rarely appears in popular treatments is the idea that Lucifer himself might be suffering more profoundly than any other demon. Some theologians proposed that his very magnitude, his memories of proximity to God, his knowledge of what he had rejected, created a torment incomparable to that of lower demons. They suggested that the pride that sustained his rebellion was simultaneously the instrument of his punishment. He got exactly what he fought for, a realm where he answered to no one, where no authority constrained him. And this isolation, this absolute autonomy divorced from any connection to the divine, constituted his deepest agony. This interpretation appears in some mystical Catholic texts and in Dante's Divine Comedy, where Lucifer in the deepest pit of hell is described not as an active tormentor, but as a tragic, almost pitiful figure, imprisoned in ice, gnashing his teeth in isolation. Dante's Lucifer is a creature whose pride has frozen him into static anguish, utterly separated from everything he might have been. What makes Lucifer theologically distinct from other fallen beings isn't merely that he fell, but the specific nature of what he rejected. Angels in Christian theology possess perfect knowledge of their own nature and limitations. They can't be deceived the way humans can be deceived. When medieval theologians described Lucifer's rebellion, they weren't explaining how a brilliant being was tricked into a wrong choice. They were explaining something far more philosophically troubling: how a being with perfect knowledge, complete understanding of the cosmic order, and full awareness of the consequences of rebellion chose to rebel anyway. This creates a paradox that medieval thinkers wrestled with extensively. How can a being with perfect understanding choose what it knows to be wrong? The answer reveals something profound about how they understood freedom itself. Freedom, in this conception, isn't the ability to make whatever choice you desire. That would be a freedom compatible with creating beings who might turn against you. True freedom, they argued, is the alignment of your will with objective truth. A being is most free when it chooses what is actually good, when it desires what is actually real and true. Lucifer's rebellion represented the opposite, a will deliberately misaligned with reality, choosing what is objectively false. The pretense that he could exist as supreme, that his will mattered more than the fundamental structure of existence itself. From this perspective, Lucifer wasn't free at all. He had enslaved himself to an illusion, and that enslavement was perpetuated through an act of will that renewed itself eternally. The medieval philosopher John Scotus Eriugena, working in the 9th century, described this paradox in language that haunts Western thought. If God is all good and all-powerful, how can evil exist? His answer was that evil doesn't exist as a substance or force. It exists only as a privation, an absence. Evil is what results when a creature turns away from the good, creating a void, a nothingness shaped like a being. This is perhaps the most philosophically elegant way to understand Lucifer. He's not fighting against God with a contrary power. He's simply choosing to negate himself, to turn away from the source of all being, thereby creating a spiritual void that he then populates with the illusion of power. If medieval Christian theology created Lucifer as a theological concept, it was Dante Alighieri who transformed him into a cultural archetype. The Inferno, the first part of Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century, presented a vision of hell so architecturally coherent, so psychologically penetrating, and so aesthetically overwhelming that it essentially rewrote how Western culture understood damnation. Dante's hell is an inverted cone descending into the earth, with 9 concentric circles, each housing souls guilty of specific sins, arranged by the severity of their transgression. But the absolute bottom, the point toward which the entire structure narrows, belongs to Lucifer. And Dante's depiction is remarkable precisely because it violates many expectations. Lucifer, in Dante's vision, is not a dynamically evil figure, not a tempter or seducer actively corrupting humans. Instead, he's frozen, literally and metaphorically frozen. He's encased in ice at the center of hell, and his wings, those magnificent wings that once carried him through the heavens, now beat futilely, unable to generate the heat necessary to free him from his icy prison. He's a figure of tragic immobility, imprisoned by his own rebellion, his own refusal. The very pride that elevated him before his fall now immobilizes him completely. What's particularly genius about Dante's approach is that he presents Lucifer as paradoxically less interesting than the human sinners in the circles above him. The human souls in hell at least experience passionate suffering. They rage, they lament, they engage in conversations that reveal their understanding of their own damnation. But Lucifer exists in a kind of spiritual stasis, chewing on the 3 greatest traitors in history, Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. Not from any active malevolence, but simply because that's what eternity has made of him. His rebellion has ended not in triumph, but in an eternal, frozen isolation. This particular vision became so culturally dominant that it essentially overwrote earlier conceptions of Lucifer. Medieval demonology had often portrayed hell as a kind of anti-kingdom, maintaining itself through Lucifer's active will. But Dante's Lucifer is almost static, a consequence of pride rather than an active manifestation of it. This shift from Lucifer as an ongoing rebellion to Lucifer as the tragic product of rebellion marked a major transformation in how Western culture understood the nature of evil itself. The medieval theological position had emphasized that evil was perpetuated through an active orientation of will away from God. But Dante's vision suggests something different, that ultimate damnation might not be an active state, but a kind of spiritual entropy, a degradation into insignificance and isolation. Lucifer in the Inferno isn't the most powerful being in hell. In some sense, he's the most pathetic. Here's something that frequently gets flattened in modern discussion. Medieval and early modern Christian theology actually distinguished between Lucifer and Satan, though the distinction became increasingly blurred over time. This distinction is crucial for understanding how Christian demonology conceptualized different aspects of rebellion and corruption. In the most rigorous theological texts, Lucifer was understood as the original name, the identity of the being before the fall. Satan, meaning adversary, was the title that emerged from his rebellion, the name that captured his new role in opposition to God. But more specifically, some theologians drew a distinction between Satan as Lucifer's identity after the fall and Satan as the archetype of adversarial force itself. Other demons could be called Satans in a secondary sense. All demons really embodied satanic opposition, but Lucifer alone was the Satan, the supreme adversary. This distinction appears consistently in the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas's writings, where he describes different classes of demons with different responsibilities. Lucifer presides over the entire structure of rebellion, but he delegates specific corrupting functions to what medieval texts call the princes of demons, each with dominion over a particular sin or category of human weakness. Mammon oversees greed, Belphegor oversees sloth, Azazel oversees human violence. But Lucifer doesn't oversee pride in the way that these demons oversee their particular vices. Pride is his essence, his fundamental nature. To serve Lucifer is to participate in pride, to assert oneself against the cosmic order. This theological precision got lost as demonology became more populist, more incorporated into folklore and superstition. By the time we reach the 16th and 17th centuries, with texts like the Malleus Maleficarum and various grimoires, Lucifer and Satan are used almost interchangeably, and the precise theological distinctions become murky. But in the height of medieval theological precision, the distinction mattered enormously for how theologians understood the structure of evil itself. What distinguishes Lucifer's particular dominion, even as understood in texts focused on his demonic underlings and their specific roles, is that pride functions as a kind of spiritual pathology that makes all other sins possible and intensifies their destructiveness. A being consumed by greed might steal, but a being consumed by greed who's also oriented by pride will steal with a quality of contempt, of refusal to acknowledge that they've transgressed. They'll rationalize, justify, argue that their taking was actually taking what belonged to them. The pride transforms the simple act of theft into something worse, a kind of cosmic argumentativeness, an insistence that the order itself is unjust. Medieval theologians identified pride as uniquely insidious because it works by inverting the language and concepts of virtue. A truly virtuous person acknowledges their virtues as gifts from God, as participation in divine goodness. A proud person, and this is where Lucifer becomes the archetype, acknowledges their virtues but attributes them to themselves, treating their power, intelligence, and beauty as possessions that belong to them alone, as evidence of their supreme worth. The actual content of consciousness might be similar, but the reference point, the center around which everything else orbits, has inverted from God to self. Thomas Aquinas spent considerable intellectual energy on this particular problem. He argued that pride differs from other sins in that it's not merely a misdirection of appetite or will, it's a fundamental misdirection of reason itself. Where lust or greed or wrath might seduce a person through the appeals of the senses or emotions, pride seduces through intellect. A person might become proud by correctly perceiving their own excellence, and then reasoning falsely about what that excellence means. They recognize their intelligence and then conclude that they therefore don't need to submit to authority. They perceive their strength and conclude that might makes right. The reasoning is coherent, but it's built on a false premise, that their excellence exempts them from the cosmic order. This is why, for medieval and early modern theology, Lucifer stood as the supreme exemplar of prideful corruption. He possessed genuine excellence. He wasn't a being who deluded himself about his own worth. His worth was real, but he took that real worth and weaponized it against the cosmic order, turning his genuine magnificence into an instrument of rebellion. While most people are familiar with Lucifer as the fallen angel cast out of heaven, fewer know about the intense theological debates that surrounded specific aspects of his nature and function. Debates that reveal sophisticated theological thinking, rarely discussed in popular treatments. One such debate concerns the question of whether Lucifer was bound in any way after his fall, or whether he remained free to roam creation, particularly the realm of human experience. Some texts suggest that Lucifer was immediately imprisoned, sealed away in the deepest reaches of hell, his rebellion already decisively ended. Others propose something far more dangerous, that Lucifer remains free, that his fall didn't constrain him, but merely redirected his energy toward the corruption of creation, particularly the creation of humanity. The Book of Revelation describes a 1,000-year binding of Satan, which medieval commentators interpreted as already occurring or as occurring in the future, depending on their theological perspective. This debate matters enormously for understanding how Christian theology conceived of human sin. If Lucifer is imprisoned, then human sins emerge from human weakness and choice. But if Lucifer is free and active, then human sins might be understood as responding to demonic temptation, as participation in Lucifer's own rebellion. This difference shapes the entire framework of moral responsibility. Another lesser-known debate concerns whether Lucifer's rebellion was solitary or whether he genuinely converted other angels to his cause. The theological texts are remarkably specific on this point. Lucifer's rebellion wasn't accepted because of superior reasoning or moral arguments. The angels who followed him were seduced by his magnificence, by the magnetic attractiveness of his person, by the glamour of his defiance. They didn't become rebels because they were convinced he was right. They became rebels because of him, because they fell under the power of his personality and will. This distinction becomes important when medieval demonology describes the demons who serve Lucifer. They're not depicted as choosing this service freely, in the way that rational agents might choose. Instead, they're held in servitude by Lucifer's will, bound to him through his superior power, his intelligence, and his utter commitment to his rebellion. In this view, hell itself is not a democracy of demons cooperating toward shared corrupting goals. It's an absolute tyranny, with Lucifer as dictator, maintaining his court through the force of his personality and will. While medieval theology engaged Lucifer primarily as a theological concept and medieval demonology as a systematic classification, modern psychology and philosophy have given us frameworks for understanding the psychological reality that Lucifer represents. The psychologist Nathaniel Branden distinguished between genuine self-esteem and defensive pride, a distinction that maps remarkably well onto medieval theological thinking. Genuine self-esteem, according to Branden, emerges from honest self-assessment aligned with reality. A person with genuine self-esteem acknowledges their strengths while recognizing their limitations, their dependence on others, and the contingency of their existence. But pride, defensive pride, emerges from a denial of these limitations, from an assertion of superiority that exists in contradiction to reality. The proud person must constantly defend against reality, constantly rationalize, constantly argue against the world's refusal to acknowledge their supreme worth. This psychological framework illuminates something profoundly true about Lucifer in the theological imagination. His rebellion isn't portrayed as emerging from a false sense of self. His rebellion emerges from a true assessment of his own magnificence, which he then orients against reality. He doesn't delude himself about his own nature. He simply insists that this nature places him above submission, above alignment with the cosmic order. The modern psychologist and theologian Paul Tillich described pride as what happens when a being tries to ground itself in itself, trying to become causa sui, the cause of itself. Every creature, in Tillich's view, is contingent. Every creature exists because something outside itself brought it into being. To deny this contingency, to insist that one's existence is self-grounded and self-justifying, is to commit the fundamental sin of pride. And this is precisely what Lucifer does. In his rebellion, he attempts to assert himself as self-grounding, as answerable to nothing outside himself. What's remarkable about this analysis is that it reveals pride as logically incoherent. A creature cannot actually become causa sui. The attempt to assert self-grounding when you are fundamentally contingent is an attempt to make the logically impossible real through sheer will. Lucifer doesn't succeed in this attempt. What he achieves instead is a kind of continuous logical contradiction, a perpetual state of trying to assert something that cannot be true. His rebellion never ends because it can never succeed. It's not that he's imprisoned by God's power. He's imprisoned by the logical structure of reality itself, by the fact that he cannot actually accomplish what he's attempting. Lucifer, across all the theological and demonological traditions that describe him, represents something far more sophisticated than simple evil. He's the archetypal embodiment of a particular form of spiritual corruption, the refusal to accept one's place in a cosmic order, the insistence on self-grounding in a universe structured around contingency and interdependence. His pride isn't the pride of ignorance, but the pride of genuine magnificence weaponized against reality. What makes his story culturally enduring? What explains why Lucifer dominates the Western imagination in ways that other demons do not? Is that his rebellion speaks to something deep in human experience. Every person encounters moments where they perceive their own excellence and confront the question of what to do with it. Will they use their gifts in alignment with something larger than themselves? Or will they insist on standing supreme, on permitting no authority greater than their own will? Lucifer chose the latter path. And in Christian theology, his choice becomes the template for understanding all rebellion against cosmic order. The tragedy, and it is a tragedy, is that Lucifer was right about one thing. He was magnificent. The error wasn't in the assessment. The error was in the conclusion drawn from that assessment. His magnificence doesn't exempt him from the cosmic order. It deepens his responsibility. And his rebellion doesn't create freedom. It creates an eternal prison of self-contradiction. The fate of attempting to accomplish the logically impossible through will alone. If you found yourself fascinated by the theological sophistication underlying Christian demonology, by how ancient and medieval thinkers grappled with questions of power, rebellion, and the nature of evil itself, please subscribe to History Scrolls. We explore these deep philosophical and mythological currents that have shaped Western civilization in ways most people never encounter. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the profound stories that built our world.